Okay, how's everybody doing tonight? Let's go ahead and get started. Week 5 is what we're starting at tonight, and we're going to be going over exposure in just a second. I want to flip over here real quick to another screen. So we'll be going over exposure here in a second. Your in-class will be doing, after our exposure discussion, we'll be using iPhoto again in class to create a contact sheet from the 30 photos from last week's ISO assignment. Remember, we showed you how to do the screenshots in here if you don't have your images with you on a USB drive or on your camera's not with you to plug it in. You can do screenshots on your Flickr account for the photos, and we'll save it as a JPEG as always. And I will have you circle 5 photos out of the 30 that turned out the best. Now we'll talk about that's kind of subjective because I forced you to use 3 ISOs for each one of your photos, and sometimes it didn't matter what ISO setting it was, it's not going to look good. And so I'm guessing most of those are when it's sunny outside or bright outside, those ISO settings washed out everything. So anyway, we'll do that in class. And then our take home we'll go over before we leave, but I'll just kind of let you know what we'll be doing for your take home. You're basically going to be using exposure this week, and you're going to be using 3 settings of exposure. Your camera has a dial on it or a button for a plus-minus exposure. It's called the EV setting. And the EV setting has in it 1, 0, -1, +1. And we'll be using those settings this week instead of ISO we did last week, which was like 100, 200, 300. You'll be doing a -1, 1, +1, or -1, 0, +1 is what you'll be doing. So let's see if I can advance now, if the internet will let me. If not, we'll do it. Okay, here you go. This one's not as many photos this week. Yay! Not too bad though, 30 photos. This week's only 15 photos. 5 photos, 5 photo settings with 3 exposures per setting. Okay? So 5 photo settings, 3 exposures per setting. So you're going to do basically, per setting, you'll do like a -1, 0, +1, and we'll talk about what that means tonight. I'm going to actually come around tonight and make sure you know where your EV setting is on your camera. And pretty much all your cameras should have this. But I'll make sure you know before you leave tonight. And so let's say you're at the mall and you're in front of the, let's say maybe one of the kiosks, or maybe you have a car show or whatever, and you're in front of whatever setting, and you're going to do a -1, 0, +1 in that setting. So it'll be 3 pictures right there. And you're going to do that 5 times in 5 areas. Okay? You'll save these on your computer just for your own purpose, whatever place it is, -1, 0, +1. So mall -1, mall 0, mall +1. Then when you upload them to week 5 set, you will label them as always with those labels accordingly. Okay? And then you'll submit, basically at the bottom, you'll submit done that you finished that, because I already have everybody's link to your websites already, so you don't need to submit that. So we'll go over that in just a second. Our notes. This PDF actually is I've used for years. I like it though because it's so simple and easy to grasp. So I'm going to try to blow it up to where we can see it a little bit better here. It talks about, in this PDF, some tips for exposure. I mentioned the first week of class, one of the most important parts of photography is exposure. And the best light you can take, you want to take that photo in. And does anybody remember the best time of day to take a photo?
Dusk and dawn.
Dusk and dawn, right, is the best time. Some of you probably experienced this last week if you were out midday trying to take photos, even with the ISO setting off or very low in bright daylight. It's really not the best time to take photos. I suggest if it's midday, like around noon and the sun's way up high, to take it in a shady area that you can find. You'll still get indirect light, but it'll be a much better photo for you. So let's talk about the 2 terms we'll look at first. Often the terms exposure value and light value are interchangeable. However, they're different. One's in front of the camera, the other's inside the camera. So again, we have EV value, exposure value. That's the EV button we're going to talk about tonight on your camera. Most of your EV buttons have a plus minus on it. And basically it's going to actually, might be in a circle, or it might actually be in a square like that with a line, and then plus and minus, something like that. Look a lot better in that drawing, by the way. So one's in front, one's inside. Exposure value, light value. The light value is the one in front of your camera. The LV is a measure of the luminance of a scene. Luminance is the amount of light reflecting off of a subject. Okay? And that subject could be a person, could be an object, could be a landscape. And so whatever light's reflecting off of that is going to be the luminance. Now, if you wake up in the morning, tomorrow morning, real early, like 5 o'clock in the morning, right when the sun's coming up, around 5:45 is when the sun starts peeking out, and you go outside with your camera, the luminance of the grass around your house or wherever you live is going to be greater because there's going to be a reflective sense on the grass because of the dew, and it'll actually look shiny almost. In fact, if you're morning, any morning people in here? Any real early morning people? Okay, you know what I'm talking about then. So when you wake up in the morning, you're outside, there's just a different feeling about morning outside. Everything looks different, everything's clear, shinier. And the whole reason for that is because of the early morning mist. I grew up on a farm, and so we would start like 4 a.m. and the pasture where the cows were, where we would go feed the cows in the morning, would just look like sometimes some mornings just really bright because of reflection off of the sun hitting that grass. Because the beads of water on the grass actually create like a mirror effect on that grass early morning.
And all the spider webs too. That's
Yeah, spider webs you can see a lot. I'm trying to think of what else. Shadows look different in the morning. Just everything looks different in the morning. And so you'll find that out. Even if you're not a morning person, try to wake up early and go outside and take a picture. Looks totally different 6 o'clock in the morning than, say, noon or 6 o'clock at night. Okay? So the light value in front of the camera, again, is the light that bounces off of the subject. We talked about grass or person in a room. And so light values are the one in front of a camera. Exposure values are on side of a camera. With ISO, linking a light value to exposure value. So light values in front, bouncing off. Exposure values inside that we'll talk about manipulating tonight and how to do that. And then ISO links a light value to exposure. Remember, ISO fakes out the sensor basically to tell it what you want it to do to offset lighting, whether good or bad in your area. So camera exposure value, the subject, light value bouncing off. In between is the ISO, okay, that's pointing back and forth, kind of bouncing back and forth. It's that value in between. And sometimes ISO you don't need to touch. It's going to be a natural ISO. Your camera will, by default, most of them be around 80 to 100 on ISO level. But when you have to manipulate the ISO is whenever this value, the light value, isn't so great, okay, isn't optimal. Like in here, not optimal light value, so you'd have to definitely adjust the ISO. And would the ISO in this room need to increase or decrease? And think about the ISO. It manipulates the sensor and fakes it out. Right, so be increasing that ISO to make it look brighter than it really is. And if it's too bright, you then decrease it. And where EV comes in, we'll talk about in just a second. It basically is inside of the camera, and what it can do is, without messing with ISO, is it can actually manipulate how that sensor looks at the light, how it sees the light. And so we'll look at that in a second. So 0 point is the initial setting for your camera. 0 for EV is your initial setting. And technically 0 point is supposed to be as the light is, if that makes sense. But we've already talked about the camera doesn't see light like we see light. The sensor doesn't see light. What do our eyes do as soon as we walk into a dark room? What does it do? They adjust immediately, right? Like within milliseconds. Sensor does not adjust. It's not an eye, it's just a sensor. And so it sees things as it is. We adjust to what our eyes, so we can walk basically. Our eyes adjust so we can walk and see things even though it might be pitch dark. So a 0 point for light values of exposure was arbitrarily set at luminance. Meaning, basically, when the camera manufacturers began to develop cameras years ago, one of the things they come up into agreement was a 0 luminance value of EV, meaning light as it is. As ISO 100, dim is 0. So I already told you earlier, the default value of your digital cameras are always 100 for ISO mainly, and 0 for EV. Meaning, if you don't touch that, and just turn your camera on, even manual or auto, really doesn't matter. If you've not messed with these values, they're going to take the photo, the camera will, as it sees it in that light, good or bad. So one of the possible exposure settings of, say you had a f1 setting on your camera, 1 second and 100. This is just a mathematical thing. So you got your camera value set at 0 by default when you turn it on, manual or say auto. The default's going to be 100. Light value is 0. And this would be like a dim subject. It would be a subject that's not real bright, not real luminous, just kind of blah type of subject. All right. This example would be probably early morning, 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning, and then dusk time, where you really don't need to mess with any settings on your camera really to get a fairly good photo. Okay. Now this is kind of hard to read, so I'm going to try to blow this up here so we can see it. I just want to mess with some of these. I don't want to go over all these, because I want us to practice here real quick. Okay, so the first one here on the left, on the middle part, it talks about different types of settings for the EV, because your EVs will actually go positive and negative. All right, so we'll look at some of these scenarios. So you've got a Times Square at night, store windows at night, fire at night, stadium lighting, interior sunlight through the window, interior with many fluorescents. Now there's a wide spectrum right there of different lights. Okay, so you got everything ranging from +8 to -7 in this range on your EV settings. So let's start at the top. Times Square at night, store windows at night, fires at night. We'll stop there. More than likely, that's going to be between the 5 and 8 range of an EV setting. Because what you're doing with an EV setting, anything above 0 that's positive, you're offsetting for the darkness in that area, the darkness in that light setting that you're in, that you're taking a picture of. So you're it's different than ISO in that you are actually manipulating how the sensor reads the light value, the LV value coming into the camera. You're not messing with ISO here. Because what EV does is it plays with the sensor, but it also plays with ISO programmatically. So you don't have to mess with it. It does both. So if you're going to use EV, you don't use ISO. It manipulates it for you. Let's talk about stadium lighting. Stadium lighting's bright, correct? If you've been to a ball game, very bright. We could say maybe street lamp lighting as well, outside by a corner street lamp. Since this is so bright, 0 is going to be too bright maybe. You might have to bring it down a little bit, like maybe a -1 or -2, -3, -4, all the way to -7 on these ones below from stadium lighting down. As the areas get brighter, you go more into the negative of your EV settings, okay, your exposure value. And let's go to the next one. You've got bright street light, street at night, stage shows with average lighting, daytime interior with skylight. That's the range it could fall in, a -8 to a 7, +7. And then fairs and amusement parks at night, daytime interior with windows and no sunlight. So the fairs and amusement parks at night is going to have a lot of lights, a lot of rides, spinning stuff with a lot of blinking lights. So in that case, you might actually go in the negative. Daytime interior with windows and no direct sunlight. It might be okay lighting, but not that great. So you might have to go more into the plus side. +1, +2, +3, +4, so on and so forth. All the way up to 7, 6 or 7. The nighttime interior with bright light. This could be inside with strobe lights on. This one's going to have to be offset by more of a negative value. Floodlight buildings, monuments, fountains, holiday lighting at night, indoor or outdoor. Night interior, the average lighting, candlelight up close. Wide range on that one, depending on your setting. And then also lastly, street at night. And so these are just some examples of some of the ranges you could have in a setting. So I want to focus, I want to skip the F values, and I want to actually go to this area here. We're actually going to end on the exposure value at the bottom of the chart. So same amounts of light, all the exposure settings in a row. If you took a series of photographs each time when you're taking exposure settings, and that's why I want you to do this week, to where you can see side by side what the EV value does to a setting from 0 or -1, 0, +1. One of the things I want to mention is down here on this area here, while the photographs may be the same shade exposure-wise, the photographs may not look the same in other ways. Differences in depth of field may be apparent due to varying length openings like shutter speed. Subject motion may be frozen or blurred depending on shutter speed. And then the EV charts. And again, this is just an example of the different EVs that could be within that range. The 100 to 1600 will be the equivalent ISO. Okay, so we start here with the 100. You'll notice 18, 17, 16, 15. All the way to 1600 ISO, much higher numbers on the EV value. Where I want you to camp at, though, for your EV values for this week and mostly throughout photography is the 0 or the -1, 0, +1 is a range you'll more than likely stay in. You don't generally go beyond today's digital camera anyway, beyond +3 and -3 on your EV value. Okay? So let's stop for just a moment. I want you to take your camera out, and we're going to see if you can find your EV value on your camera. Come around real quick to see if you have it. While you do, I'm going to actually bring up an EV value